Well, we want to welcome our friends at our two locations, not in Pine City, our friends at Miracle Mile and at Watkins, Glen. Let's welcome them and welcome each other right now. As we enter this month of June, I was wondering what we might establish a teaching series about, and I felt led in the last few days to address the subject that's kind of related to what you've heard many times before, but different. I'm calling it the purpose-driven family. And going back, I think it was 1998, before I came to Penn Ave, I was out at Rick Warren's church in California, and it was then that he had just come out with the purpose-driven church, and he had not yet come out with a purpose-driven life, but I was intrigued with that whole concept. And a few years later, John and Sue and Mark and I went out to California to the Saddleback Church, and coming back from that, we were all the more inspired to challenge us as a church to become purpose-driven. It's been interesting to me how what we've done is such a small scale compared to Saddleback or some other churches across the country or around the world. But just recently, again, PAUMC was lifted up as a model of multi-site. In fact, I've been invited to represent you this next fall, September through June, I think it's going to be, at a monthly meeting in Syracuse where we talk about multi-site and how we can spread that understanding across our conference. So you've been a part of that growing edge, if you will. So we've gone from being a purpose-driven church with an emphasis on the personal, purpose-driven lives. And the last time we went through this book, they changed the title. It's the same book, but the title changed to What on Earth Am I Here For? You ever ask that question? What on earth am I here for? And so we talk about the emphasis on the church or individual, but it also spills over on family as well. Just a few weeks ago, we celebrated Mother's Day, and we believe that the ladies in our church family are so vital to who we are and to our future. And in a couple of weeks, it'll be Father's Day, and we want to lift up the importance of dads and men in our lives as well. And then the last Sunday of this month of June is going to be Graduate Recognition Day. And I think this matter of purpose-driven applies to all those different people in all those different categories as well. So today I'd like us to begin a series, and I'm going to visit this for another few weeks in June, what it means to be a purpose-driven family. And today I'd like to lift up to you 5 habits of purpose-driven families. You have a little half sheet of notes, hopefully available to you. By habits, I mean best practices, marks of being purpose-driven as it gets applied not just to the church or to us as individuals, but by families. I don't mean just mom, dad, and 2.5 kids, but I mean our growth groups and our relationships with others. I am blessed each week when I make this recording on a Wednesday to have a family here with me, and I appreciate folks that come every week. So I'm not just talking to a camera by itself, but we got a crowd, maybe that's a stretch, but a family. And families come in all shapes and sizes and dimensions, but we are blessed to have, to be a church not just with groups, but a church of groups, of growth groups, and of smaller expressions of family, if you will. So the first habit that I would lift up to you as I launch this teaching series about the purpose-driven family is that the first habit is that we need to encourage big dreams. And we dream together when we come together. We encourage each other. We inspire the best. We want to get the best out of each other. When I first came here, I have very few original thoughts. And one of the thoughts that I stole from somebody was one of my acronyms, TEAM, spells team. Together, everyone achieves more. I still believe that to be true 21 years later. And we come together as a team to dream big dreams, to encourage that. It's teamwork that helps the dream work, if you will. Another platitude. Who did I steal that from? I couldn't tell you. Our memory verse this week is from Ephesians 4:29. Would you read that with me? Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And where is that? Ephesians 4:29. If you study the book of Ephesians or Colossians, you'll see that the first half is more theology. There's 6 chapters in the book of Ephesians. First chapters, second and third, are understanding about God. 4, 5, and 6 are how does that apply to your lives? Well, part of chapter 4 is how does this apply? We need to build each other up as part of the team, if you will. We want to benefit others. So dreaming occurs best in a team, and our teams, whatever way we define them, are centered around worship. Remember this ball diamond that we looked at last week? I'd like to come back and visit that again. This is actually a picture taken, I think, with somebody's phone from the wall in the narthex at Pine City. And what is central to that ball diamond, besides the 4 bases, what's right in the middle? Worship. Worship is our focus. It's central to who we are. And as we worship God individually, personally, as a church, as smaller family groups or growth groups, we're teams coming together to worship, and it's out of that worship that we are built up. God builds us up, and we build each other up. So that's the first habit of a purpose-driven family, is to encourage big dreams. A second habit is to develop blind faith. In order to pay it forward, we need to pray it forward. And we have faith that sees beyond what we can see with our physical eyes, but we go forward and we give to the future. And Jesus in Acts 20, verse 35b, is quoted as saying, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Now that's a mystery verse because you don't find that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but somehow Paul knew that that's what Jesus said. So there must have been another source that he got that from, but isn't that true? Doesn't that sound like Jesus? It is more blessed to give than to receive, and we do that in faith. I'm remembering something that is in the Gospels, and it's John chapter 20, where, remember Thomas was one of the disciples that didn't happen to be there the first Sunday when Jesus appeared in a locked room with the other disciples. And they had all seen him, and Thomas was left out. He came back the following. Thomas, in the meantime, said, well, unless I see for myself, if I see the nail prints in his hands and I put my hand in his side, then I'll believe. But I'm not going to believe until then. Well, long story short, Jesus appears that next week, that next Sunday, as if he's there just for Thomas. And he says, well, here, Thomas, put your hand in my side. Put your fingers in the holes in my hands. And Thomas refuses to do that. But he says in John 20, verse 28, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus says to Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And so he is saying, not seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. And that's what we're called to do, is to develop that kind of faith that we see even though we don't see. Does that make sense? That blind faith. And this matter of giving, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Giving is an act of blind faith in a well. It's an act of planting in faith. We just passed Memorial Day, and as a kid, I associate Memorial Day with planting the family garden for the year. Anybody else have that recollection? You had to wait till Memorial Day to be sure you weren't going to lose stuff to a frost. And sometimes there were perfectly good pieces of examples of produce that you put into the ground, with blind faith that something would result from that. But if you don't invest and you don't sow, you're not going to reap a harvest. Well, giving is like that. It's an act of planting in faith. And that needs to permeate our families. That's a mark of a purpose-driven family, is that giving, generous attitude. I'm not going to just hoard it. I'm not going to hold on to it, but I'm going to give it away. We practiced that last weekend, and we're still waiting for results. You'll be hearing some more finalized results, but I heard from Donna, our financial secretary, right after last Sunday that she collected 78 estimate of giving cards last weekend. Some of you maybe haven't had a chance to participate yet. And out of those 78 cards, 24 of them were brand new people that had never filled out a card before, and 30 had increased their giving from the year before. Let's give a yay God. Isn't that great? That has worked. We've done that for 21 years, folks, and it never ceases to amaze me, that law of developing blind faith, of giving, even though you don't know exactly what you're going to see. So we took a step with consecration stewardship last weekend, and if you didn't get a chance to do that, there should be copies of the estimate of giving card available in back at either of your locations today. Another example of taking a step of blind faith, if you will, was last fall when we had our 2020 Vision Better Together campaign. And we're beginning to see some results from that. You know, you give and you respond to it and you say, well, where are the results? What are we going to see some progress? I got to tell you, this summer should be a time that we're planting some seeds, and you're going to see some remarkable things happening this summer. And we're so excited to look forward to that. So first of all, we encourage dreaming big. Second of all, we develop blind faith. A third habit of a purpose-driven family is that we learn to walk a narrow path. I have a couple verses there. I'd like to reverse the order, reading first from John 17:15. John 17 is Jesus' prayer. It's a whole chapter devoted to the prayer that he prayed for his disciples, not only for the original disciples, but for all who would come to faith as a result of their faith, and that includes us a couple thousand years later. And he said this, he says, I do not pray that you, that is God, that you, God, should take these disciples out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. He knew that they were going to be in the world, but he wanted them to be protected, and he wanted them to have a strong faith as they walked a narrow path. He had referred to a narrow path earlier on when he gave what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:13 and 14. Would you read this with me? Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And so we have to realize that the way is going to be challenging, and it's going to be narrow, and it's a lot easier to follow the broad road that leads to destruction, but he wants us to stay on the straight and narrow, and as we do that, our families, our mutual associates in the walk will journey together on that narrow path. A fourth habit of a purpose-driven family is to recognize divine direction. Just this week, I visited somebody who's a little bit over 90 years old, and he may be in his last days. He's gasping for breath. He's on more and more oxygen. He's not been a churchgoer, but he's embraced faith in the last weeks or months that I've talked with him. And as we talked about that, and I said, well, you know, we realize at a time like this that God is in control, that we're not. He said, I bet a dozen times I've prayed that to God. God, you're in control. And in essence, he's trying to die. He's saying, okay, God, I'm ready. I want to go. And yet it's a mystery. We don't understand why it doesn't happen the way we wish it would. One time, early on in my time at PAUMC, there was a woman so assured of her salvation, she just wanted to go. She didn't want to struggle anymore. And she said, raise my bed up higher. She wanted us to raise her hospital bed up higher so she'd be closer where God could take her more easily. Only time I've ever seen that happen. But we recognize that God is in control. We recognize divine direction. I think about divine direction in the story of Samuel. Remember, Samuel was dedicated by his mother Hannah for service in God's temple. And Samuel became, he was mentored by Eli, the priest. And he slept in a bed alongside of Eli's bed. And one night, God started to speak to Samuel. And he said, he thought it was Eli. Well, yes, what did you want, sir? What did you want, Lord? No, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. After a couple times, Eli realizes maybe God is speaking to this young boy. So the next time you hear that voice call your name, say, speak, for your servant is listening. You have that part of the verse right there. Speak, for your servant is listening. That's not a bad prayer to pray, is it? Say that with me right now. Speak, for your servant is listening. And when we ask God to speak and we listen long enough, he will speak to us. And so we learn to recognize divine direction, to learn to discern God's voice. One of the songs that God sent our way back when we were about to go to Arnett Mall years ago, 2012, that would be 6.5 or so years ago right now, was the song, "If you say go, I will go. If you say wait, I will wait." And so we get more practice at discerning God's direction and figuring out what God wants us to do. Because sometimes God says, change your speed, go, wait, you're ahead of me. You're not moving fast enough. And we have to tune in the best we can. And we're never going to get this perfectly right. But we try to figure out what it is, when God wants us to move, when he wants us to wait, how fast we should be moving. I use the example of the garden. You could jump the gun and put your garden in at the end of April, and it might not work so well. Or if you wait too long to be extra safe and you say you wait till 4th of July, New York State, that ain't going to work. So you got to find the right timing and discern God's direction. Also, he might have us change lanes. I remember a time when I was in Los Angeles and navigating on my own. I rented a car, and I had to find my way to a conference across Los Angeles during the busiest time of the drive time in the afternoon. And a frustration to me is Los Angeles wasn't laid out very carefully with respect to interstates. It was kind of haphazard. And you'd be looking for such and such an exit, and there's 5 lanes going one way, and you're on this side thinking the exit's got to be here. Oh, it was over there, and in retrospect, it went by over there. And I understand that a couple of our ladies had a little trouble like that in Baltimore just recently, Gail and Diane. They're part of my family here today, so I had to throw them under the bus. Diane was driving, but Gail owned that she might have made a mistake with the GPS. How's that? The Gail positioning system there didn't come through. So that happens, and we just have to be versatile and flexible enough to change lanes when we need to. Or, gentlemen, this is a hard thing for us to admit that we're lost. Anybody ever go on for another hour because they didn't want to accept the fact that they'd made a wrong turn? So God gives us entrance ramps and exit ramps. And in order to take advantage of them, we have to be in the right lane. So again, it's learning to recognize God's divine direction. A third aspect of God's divine direction is knowing when we need to change passengers. Maybe we're going in the wrong direction and we're influenced by people that should not be influencing us. We're not hanging around with people that are going to be godly, inspirational people, but they're pulling us in different directions. We see that happen with our kids. You ever see it happen with adults too? And you're seeking the approval of the wrong people, perhaps. And so we have to be careful who influences our lives. What relationships do we have? Now, I'm not talking about necessarily about your marriage. We've made a commitment in marriage, and we're in that for the long haul. We're in it till death do us part. But there are other influences that we need to be wise and discerning about. People who can influence us for good, or people whose influence might not be so good. And so all of this is a matter of family finding their purpose, is to help each other, to speak into each other's lives, to be a part of discovering God's direction in our life. And lastly, a fifth habit of a purpose-driven family is the willingness to risk courageous leadership, to do the hard thing and to take a chance even though it could fail. I remember when years ago, some of the people in my family here today remember when we talked about changing the name of Pennsylvania Avenue United Methodist Church. And we had an open dialogue, and we had it put it to a vote, and people came out of the woodwork to vote against that baby. Um, when it came time a few years after that to have another location and to end up at Regal Cinema in Arnett Mall, did you notice that I didn't allow that go to a vote? I just kind of said, even before I knew where we were going, a year before, I said, I really think God's calling us to another location. I didn't say, is it okay? Can we have a vote on it? We did it, and it succeeded. A few years after that, we had an opportunity to go to Watkins, Glen. And we had to have a vote that time. There were some other dynamics involved. There was a house involved and some money. So we had to have the district superintendent come, and we voted. And the vote was 99% in favor. I think there was one uncertainty, but 21-1 or something like that. And how we had decided it's okay to take a risk because God had come through the last time we took a risk. Can I get a witness? Isn't that the way God works in our lives? We're willing to risk, and we realize that if we're going to increase our success rate, we have to be willing to fail. We have to be willing to embrace failure sometimes to find success. As I like to say, failure can be fertilizer. Going back to that garden image, I think about, not to be too graphic, but when we put the family garden in on Memorial Day, we had some cow manure involved as well, and that wasn't pleasant to deal with, but it sure helped the garden grow, so things like that. I think of a transition time in the nation of Israel. Moses has led them out of Egypt, and miracle after miracle. They spent 40 years in the wilderness, and they struggled, and the old-timers whined and complained, but they're ready to enter the promised land when Moses dies, and God buries Moses. And the successor to Moses is Joshua. And Joshua, in the book called Joshua, chapter 24, confronts the people. He's their new leader. And he says, choose you this day who you're going to serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And so as a family, as a purpose-driven family, we make our priority that we're going to serve the Lord. And we lift that up, and we're willing to take risk in order for that to happen. So as I wrap this up, I would share with you that your leadership is influence. And the leadership you have as moms or dads or grandparents or members of a growth group, people who have nieces or friends that you want to influence for God is very significant. And your leadership is to be as excellent a leader as you can be. Good enough is not good enough. We're called from this point on, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Regardless of the mistakes I've made, the exits I've missed, the wrong turns in my life, from this point on, I want to go forward. I want this 2020 vision to help me focus on what God has for the rest of my life and for the future of our church. So I would like you today to be thinking about wise and creative ways you can help move your family to God's purposes. The next ramp that's coming that you need to take. What is your next step? What are the next steps God is calling you to take so that you can be part of a purpose-driven family? Amen.